Tissue healing refers to the replacement of destroyed tissue by living tissue, with there being two essential components. Regeneration is where specialised tissue is replaced by the rapid increase of surrounding undamaged specialised cells. The repair component is where lost tissue is replaced by granulation tissue, which then matures to form scar tissue. And it's this repair process that we're going to be looking at in this video. The 4 stages of the healing process are bleeding, inflammation, proliferation, and remodelling. However, each of these phases are not separate. They are actually interlinked in a way that each stage acts as a stimulant for the next phase. Bleeding takes place immediately following trauma and up to 4 to 8 hours after injury has occurred. When an assault on the body has occurred, hemostasis takes place. Hemostasis is a sequence of responses that stops bleeding. When blood vessels are damaged, the hemostatic response must be quick, localised in damaged area, and carefully controlled in order to be effective. There are 3 mechanisms which reduce blood loss. Number 1. Vascular spasm. When blood vessels are damaged, the muscles in their walls contract immediately. This is known as a vascular spasm. This causes vasoconstriction, which means that blood loss is reduced for several minutes to several hours, during which time the other hemostatic mechanisms come into operation. This reduced blood flow means that the oxygen levels drop, causing hypoxia. This is when the tissue is deprived of adequate oxygen supply. This then leads to necrosis, where the damaged cells then die off due to the lack of oxygen. Number 2. The platelet plug formation. Platelets, which are small fragments found in blood, contact and stick to parts of the damaged blood vessel. Over time, the accumulation and attachment of large numbers of platelets form a mass called a platelet plug. Although initially the platelet plug is loose, it becomes quite tight when reinforced by fibrin threads that are formed during blood clotting. And finally, number 3, blood clotting or coagulation. Normally, blood remains in its liquid form as long as it stays within its vessels. However, if it's drawn from the body via the injury site, then it thickens and forms a gel, which then forms a blood clot. This happens as the enzyme thrombin converts fibrinogen, a soluble protein found in blood, to fibrin. The fibrin, which is an insoluble protein, then creates a temporary web which traps red blood cells within its threads, causing coagulation or blood clotting. We can think of fibrin as a mini Spider-Man, which creates a mini web. As the fibrin web traps the red blood cells, this stops the bleeding, reduces lymphatic drainage, and aids in localising the injury, also trapping any foreign particles and debris. The normal bleeding time to stop varies with the nature of the injury, as well as the nature of the tissues involved. The more vascular the tissue, meaning that it has more blood vessels, the longer the bleeding time. Therefore, muscle tissue, which has a high vascularity, will bleed for longer with more blood volume than, say, ligaments, which are less vascular. Now we can move on to the second phase in the healing process, which is the inflammatory phase. Now, despite what many people think, the inflammatory phase is an essential component of the tissue repair process. It is not a reaction to be concerned about or try to prevent. Now, please note that this is referring to a post-injury inflammatory response as opposed to chronic inflammation. But when it comes to healing, it is a normal and necessary component. The inflammatory phase has a rapid onset, usually a few hours at most, and quickly increases to its maximum reaction, usually 1 to 3 days, before gradually resolving over a couple of weeks. There are 2 essential elements to the inflammatory phase. Number 1, vascular, and number 2, cellular. As well as the changes already stated to the damaged blood vessels at the injured site, there are also changes in the undamaged blood vessels. In the bleeding phase, we had vasoconstriction in order to stop the bleeding. However, within the inflammatory phase, vasodilation occurs for the duration of the inflammatory response. This means that there is an increase of blood flow. The cause of this dilation is mainly due to a chemical response, such as histamine. In addition to the vasodilation response, there is also an increase in the vasopermeability of the local vessels. This means that the vessels become leaky. This means that there is an increase in the exudate, which is basically fluid released from the vessels. Hence, why we get swelling during this phase. This exudate has a number of jobs to do. It dilutes any irritant substances in the damaged area, and it binds with proteoglycans, which are protein molecules, to create a gel which limits local fluid flow and further traps various particles and debris. So now we're on to the cellular part of the inflammatory phase. Now during the inflammatory phase, phagocytes, which are cells that protect the body, emigrate from the vessels. These macrophages, as they are known, being a large phagocyte, are essential in the repair process. Dead and dying cells, fibrin mesh and clot residue from the bleeding phase all need to be removed. Macrophages use their scavenger properties to collect all this waste, as well as foreign bodies such as bacteria. The easiest way is to think of these macrophages or phagocytes as Pac-Man. And this is known as phagocytosis, phago referring to eating and cyto meaning cells. Macrophages also release chemicals as an end product of phagocytosis during the inflammatory stage, such as lactic acid, which mediate fibroblastic activation. In a nutshell, this means that it starts the next phase in the healing process, which is proliferation. As a side note, turning off or limiting the inflammatory events not only reduces the cleaning up of the wound, but also reduces the signal strength, stimulating the next phase. And as you'll see soon, that's not something you want to happen. Now we're moving on to phase 3 in the healing process, which is the proliferation phase. And it is this phase that we can think of as the actual repair phase. This is where tissue continuity is restored with the deposit of repair tissue, or as it's better known, scar tissue. There are two fundamental processes involved in the repair or the proliferative phase. Number 1, fibroplasia, and number 2, angiogenesis. When chemically mediated, particularly by chemicals released from the macrophages during the inflammatory stage, fibroblasts migrate to the injured site and lay down type 3 collagen or connective tissue. This is what is referred to as fibroplasia, and in simple terms, is the laying down of scar tissue. In this case, we can think of fibroblasts as a grown-up Spider-Man. Angiogenesis refers to the development of new blood vessels. This is where capillaries in the injured region bud and grow towards the repair zone. As the new blood vessels develop, this re-establishes a blood flow, providing oxygen and nutrients, as well as removing metabolic waste, which is critical for collagen production. Now the final phase within the healing process is stage 4, or the remodelling phase. And this remodelling phase is primarily involved in the refinement of the collagen. When first laid down in the proliferation phase, the collagen is type 3, which is relatively weak and has random orientation. During the remodelling phase, however, a proportion of the fine type 3 collagen is reabsorbed and is replaced with type 1, which is more orientated in line with local stresses, as well as having more cross-bridging and a greater tensile strength. This phase overlaps considerably with the proliferative phase, with final remodelling continuing for months and typically at least a year from the initial damage. There are several influential factors during this long phase, including that of physical stress or exercise. In a nutshell, physical stress is an important component in the development of quality repair tissue. And if you are worried about re-injury and therefore avoid putting stress on the tissue, this can actually cause more problems than getting out and applying appropriate stress. Tissue healing is a complex and dynamic system which enables effective repair of damaged tissue. Hopefully now you will see why it's important to understand the healing process. Knowing what is about to happen, knowing what needs to happen, and knowing what we can do to help it happen is what will enable us to continue to improve our body strength and function.